So, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. This is World War II TV again, the first of a double header of programs today on this lovely winter Sunday. And today, the first show, we are tackling the Dieppe raid, the legendary raid by Canadian and British forces in August 1942. And I advertised this show as sort of a single program, but in the chat I had with David a couple of days ago, it's probably going to end up being at least two, maybe even three, because there's just so much to unpack and examine with this. So, but I'll start by introducing David. So you've all known David. He's done the Operation Spring shows and other stuff with us. So David's a regular on World War II TV, professor of history, author, former soldier, TV. You know, he's done it all, right? An all-rounder, a bit like myself. So good afternoon, or rather good morning to you, David.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
So, in terms of introduction, Dieppe is up there in Canadian history, like Vimy Ridge or Hong Kong, or you know, it is just an event that carries so much mystique and pride. It's to do with Canadian identity. There's lots of a big cast of people, Lord Louis Mountbatten, and in your book, Ian Fleming, and commandos and rangers, and Churchill's gets involved, and Stalin kind of is half involved here and there. So there's a lot to get involved in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to just essentially start at the very beginning and talk initially about how Dieppe has been recorded in the past as an event. And, you know, you're the Canadian, David, I'm the Brit living in Normandy, but I'll just present my point of view of how I've always kind of had Dieppe presented to me as someone who is a Normandy guy. And that is that the Dieppe raid is all about learning lessons for Operation Overlord 2 years later into Normandy. That's how it's kind of packaged here. You see it in museums referenced in that way. They'll talk about, you know, and we learned this on Dieppe and we learned that, we learned about tanks there, and it gets kind of thrown in there as this lesson finding exercise. And then you have all the other high level stuff, the second front aspect, the keeping Stalin happy, Churchill doing stuff, PR stunts. There's a whole lot of stuff around it. But of course, before I'm going to let David talk, I want to say that anything we discuss during this program is about the planning of the operation. At no point are we taking anything away from the bravery and the sacrifice of all those thousands and hundreds of guys who fell and were wounded and were captured that day. This is an examination of the purpose of the raid, and we're not in any way talking about any lack of bravery or initiative shown by men on the ground. We just want to get that clear right at the beginning, that we're looking at this from a kind of a critical point of view, 78 years on. So David, how has Dieppe been talked about in the past since World War II? Or has it been through various stages? I find is a better question.
Oh yeah, it's been through many, many stages. And I think to get back to what you were talking about right off the top, for Canada, I would argue that for many, many years, probably until Burton's book came out on Vimy, that we always looked at Dieppe since 1942 as perhaps that seminal moment in Canadian military history, albeit not necessarily for positive reasons. And that's because that, you know, in little under between 6 and 9 hours, 907 Canadian soldiers died in a very quick butcher and bolt raid that apparently for many, many years had no real purpose. And I guess that then connects to, you know, what you were saying off the top about the lessons learned approach, which is ex post facto. In other words, it comes after the fact. And that's one of the problems with the Dieppe narrative up until this point, is everything has been ex post facto. In other words, you can write anything you want after an event goes down. And so the lessons learned, I mean, I've always kind of laughed at it a little bit because, you know, obviously it's kind of like, and I don't know if you remember the old show Cheers, you know, the set in the bar in Boston, they had the know-it-all Cliff Clavin. Well, when he finally gets his chance to get on Jeopardy, which is his life dream, he bets it all on a question he can't answer. And the answer is people who have never been in my kitchen. Well, this is kind of what the lessons learned are, right? It's people who have never been in my kitchen. You can basically, you know, fob off anything you want by saying that. I mean, you and I are doing this. We're doing this to talk about Dieppe. You're not doing this to learn about how to produce one of these shows. You're going to pick up stuff along the way, without a doubt. But that's not the issue. So Part of that, and this is the central problem with Dieppe, the narrative is written right after the fact by the lead planner and the naval force commander, okay, one and the same, John Hughes Hallett. And then, of course, it's spun for all it's worth by Mountbatten. Now, Mountbatten is, of course, branding combined operations. He's building his empire. Hughes Hallett is a huge component of that. And one of the problems is that we base it on the original narrative is pretty much based on two things. One is Hughes Hallett's memoirs, which are unpublished, which are in archives around the world, and they're heavily sanitized for obvious reasons. For the other thing, we also have this question of security, and also to his report. And this is one of the big problems. His Dieppe report becomes the center of gravity in our understanding, but his report is not only heavily sanitized, the evidence is cherry-picked for it. So for instance, all the units that were involved, whether it be naval, air, land, all wrote reports at the end. They were all submitted to combined operations. And then when they reemerged in a packaged form. And you can actually see when you go through the components, how he's just cherry-picked the information out of the reports to create a particular narrative. So this is the problem right from the start. As historian Pete Henshaw has said, it's a shaky edifice. And the whole understanding up until this point has been based on that. So that's one of the big problems that we're dealing with when we deal with Dieppe and any kind of reason for it.
And I think it's, we said before we went live, it's for those who are watching who are cynical about this, as I was myself before I finished the book. And we are talking, of course, about around One Day in August, which is the new edition. There was a previous edition. This is the updated one that came out this year. And I went into it cynically. We had a conversation about doing this show 3 or 4 months ago when we were doing the Normandy shows.
Yep.
And I was a tough sell. I talked to a couple of people about it, and Mike Bechtold and others, and I was, I'm not so sure. So I went into it in a very kind of, you'll have to work hard to convince me. And I'm kind of giving the game away. You did convince me, and then we'll go through and explain that as we unravel it. But a thought occurred to me when we're talking about 1942. There's previous for single accounts steering how badly battles have been looked at. I'm thinking about Midway. That Japanese commander who told the version for years and years and years. I'm just doing a very, very basic version of it about the carrier, the aircraft on decks and torpedoes and bombs and changing blah, blah, blah. They made movies, they wrote books, they did this, that. And then Shattered Sword, that excellent book, came out about 7 or 8 years ago that basically blew out of the water, no pun intended, when we're talking about a naval battle, all this original history. And they rebuilt the Midway story kind of from scratch and realized that everything we thought we knew about, and I was reading it going, but I thought I knew this. I thought it was one of those books that kind of, without sounding pretentious, changed my life about the understanding of that battle. And your Dieppe book is in that kind of vein, that it's like it's rewriting stuff. So to be clear, you've been through 150,000 documents. You've been to
pages of documents,
original documents. You've been there, and for those who've maybe read the first book or seen the documentary, the new book has more archival information that came out post that book. So there's another layer of evidence, another paper trail that you investigated, and people and veterans and survivors. So this isn't just some half-spun idea. You just sat at your desk one day and went, I'm going to write a book about this, and just, you went back into it. So well,
I guess, maybe just, quickly back at the start. I mean, I never expected to touch Dieppe. But as a Canadian military historian, you can't get away from it. I mean, that's one of the issues. Dieppe, everything is measured by Dieppe. When I was writing about Normandy, and, Mike Bechtold's out there and Alex Black, I'm sure they understand. You have to measure it by
and both
Dieppe.
Both are watching this,
good,
by the way. So
good, yeah. Well, they know that you have to measure everything by Dieppe. And so as a result, as a Canadian military history historian, you're not going to get away from it. Also, I was working with one of the Dieppe scholars at the time, and I was not studying Dieppe, and that was Dr. Brian Villa, who wrote Unauthorized Action. And we are opposed on some things, obviously. But in this particular case, I never wanted to tackle it because I saw the kind of uproar that occurred when he dared to challenge this, incredible, national trophy, if you will, that we keep on the shelves. And I think what sort of kept me from doing this originally and then kept my research very quiet over the 20 or 15-year period before I went public with it is simply the reaction. In other words, historically, for whatever reason, we get ingrained, like you were mentioning about Midway. There is a certain story, narrative that we develop that we get comfortable with. It's like the comfortable old shoes, whether they're ratty or not, the old slippers you're going to wear, or better yet, in sporting terms, it's like getting together with the boys, your mates that you've played, either baseball or football or soccer or whatever with years later, and you now start recounting the stories, right? And it's all about how you feel as opposed to what you actually think. And I think Dieppe took that on, albeit in a weird way. Dieppe's not a good story. It's not a good story, but somehow we, particularly as Canadians, became very comfortable in hearing that narrative. So anytime, and I guess you could argue in history in general, anytime you are going to try to change a narrative, or better yet, as the evidence changes the narrative, then there is going to be that natural cynicism, or perhaps skepticism, it would be the appropriate way of putting it. Some people are cynical in it, but really the skepticism, which is fine, and that's understandable. And so when you come out with something like this and you tackle something that has the gravitas of Dieppe, you have to do your homework. You have to be able to go back and rebuild the beast, as you mentioned. And that's essentially what I did starting in 1995. So now you're looking at the culmination of 25 years work and over 150,000 pages, not documents, but pages of documents, which is like 300 gigs that I have digitized on a hard drive. And I didn't realize that until I finished it. And part of it is because when you're dealing with something like this, you have to look at all aspects of our interpretations, all the different interpretations. And of course, that's what we're going to tackle today in what is part one, is the various interpretations.
Yeah. And, and we discussed in our practice for this, the various sort of ideas about proving a thesis and scientifically approaching something new. Scientists, when they have a theory, they're wanting people to examine it and say, no, it's wrong. They're wanting the proof. You're making an assertion, and it's the person who asserts something has to back their case up, and then people have a counter claim and say, if they believe it's wrong, they have to give what their alternative. You're wrong, and here's why you're wrong. And it's interesting because I was talking to David a couple of days ago when I was doing rehearsal, because I use Amazon, various websites for buying books. And when I was looking for David's book on Amazon.fr, the kind of books that came up in the "you may also like this" book were kind of real, kind of off the wall conspiracy stuff, like, Hitler living in South America, those kind of. And I was thinking, no, it's not that kind of area at all. But that's somehow what was going on Amazon, is that algorithm was kicking in there and suggesting, and it's not somewhat a conspiracy book is those things like Killing Patton by Bill O'Reilly, where he has his theory in place. He has his "I want Patton to have been knocked off by the OSS, CIA, whoever it fucking was in the book," and he writes a book ignoring all the evidence that goes against that, but cherry picking all the evidence that points to so navigating a path that leads him, however difficult the route is, to his end result. And that's not what in fact, every step of the book, you're inviting criticism, you're inviting your own criticism, and you're going, no, and you go down some massive great rabbit holes. There's entire chapters on the naval war and U-boats and the dealings with Russia and stuff, and I'm reading it thinking, is this entirely necessary? But then as you get through it, you realize you had to go for all that to build your case. It's like a long court case, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the best way of putting it is, and maybe court isn't the right way. It's not so much building your case as it is testing the case.
Yeah.
Because when you put a hypothesis out there, you can either have something that is supported 100%, something that is completely dismissed, or somewhere in the middle. And at the end of the day, that's a contribution. Because if it doesn't make any sense, then guess what? We don't have to go down that road anymore. We can move on. So that was the idea. The idea was, and of course, when I first found the first document, which of course was the creation of the intelligence assault unit, the fact that it was connected to Dieppe, and then of course, the double-edged sword in all of this, Ian Fleming, which is fantastic for attention and fantastic for sales, but oh my God, is it a historical minefield to walk through?
Yeah.
You're inviting an increased degree of criticism and cynicism right off the bat because of the way Fleming has been treated in history. And so I was sober enough to realize when I decided I was going to, go down this route, I knew what I was going to, I knew what I was in for. Let's just say that, I knew the kind of criticism that was going to come up. And at the end of the day, I've got no issue with the criticism if it's legitimate based on the evidence. In other words, please, by all means, be schooled, either read the book, go into the archives yourself, but, simply don't just, throw something out there that has been floating around for years. Let's have a real discussion about this.
Yeah, which is essentially what we're going to do. And we should point out now that, as you said, this is going to be the first of maybe 2 or 3 shows, and we'll do some show in the future, post-lockdown, post-COVID, where we have cameras in Dieppe, and we'll talk about the stages of the actual operation. I don't think in this show we're going to go through who was doing what on the beaches, things like that. We'll save all that for a future. It's all about the planning, the preparation, how the operation came about, and so let's kind of get to grips with it. So Ian Fleming is central to this story, and for anyone who doesn't know, I can't believe there's anyone watching who doesn't know, Ian Fleming, of course, went on to write the rather famous James Bond books and became a legendary figure. He kind of allowed this mystique to kind of hang in the air around himself, and allowed stories to be spread around him, and rumor and mystery. It was all part of the PR image of being the mysterious writing living in the Caribbean who wrote these spies. So, but of course, before that, he was a Royal Naval officer involved in some pretty by the book kind of operations in World War II, and the mystique kind of comes in later on, and you have all this baggage of everyone's looking for everyone he ever met as being, is that M, is that Moneypenny, is that Bond, is that Scaramanga, is that so-and-so, which just kind of muddies the water and confuses the issue. And Mountbatten, of course, Mountbatten is an immediately contentious figure as well, and ended up being killed by the IRA, just been covered in The Crown recently, of course, and so he's back in the news again now. And Mountbatten had a very interesting life as well, and marriage and extramarital affairs and this, that, and the other. So both of those figures, as soon as you bring them into a story, there's lots and lots and lots of baggage to go through.
That's the historical minefield I was talking about.
Just
simply because that people have certain opinions about them, and sometimes it's very difficult to separate the opinions from the fact. And I think number one was coming to terms with who Ian Fleming was circa 39 to 42. And, first of all, he's not James Bond. And I've said this many times, he didn't act like James Bond, etc. But because a lot of people have thought he was over the years, or, he even perhaps, fashioned himself like that at times, or certainly his publicists after his death did, there seems to be a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to go 180 degrees the opposite way and far past what the goalpost would be. In other words, he was not Bond, did not go into operations, was not an agent by any means, but he was not the faceless bureaucrat either, the bureaucrat that talked out of the top of his hat. Not at all. As a matter of fact, he was recruited into naval intelligence by the DNI, Admiral John Godfrey in 1939, because of his character. He was Machiavellian. He was creative, and this is what Godfrey wanted. Godfrey wanted a decentralized style of command where he could place a lot of trust and perhaps plausible deniability in his subordinates for creating the kind of operations and dealing with the kind of portfolios that Fleming ends up taking on. And, even to the point where in some of the historiography, we see historians, Nigel West, who, is widely known as sort of a mouthpiece for British intelligence. He came out for many, many years saying, oh, Fleming is nothing. Fleming is nothing. Fleming was never ultra indoctrinated. Fleming had nothing to do. He just, he was larger than life, and let's forget about him and move on. Well, through the research, you find out that there's a good reason for him wanting to do that, because Fleming, according to Godfrey and backed up by the files, had his finger in every single pie in intelligence during the war. As the assistant to the naval director, he was responsible for liaising with MI5, MI6, Bletchley Park, Ministry of Economic Warfare, Political Warfare Executive, SOE, the Americans, both the OSS and the FBI, or the COI before it became the OSS, and the Joint Intelligence Committee as well, which is something that we never really knew. So this has all been established by the research, and without a doubt, he was ultra indoctrinated. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. There's a couple of pages where it shows who in naval intelligence, in particular, who in the Navy were indoctrinated, and sure enough, there it is. His name is there. A lot of the stuff that I've just talked about, I've actually posted on my Facebook page. And so, feel free to go and take a look at the documents as well. So that was the idea. The idea was to find out. And one of the big portfolios that he carried was developing pinch operations. Okay, so in other words, capturing material that was desperately needed by the codebreakers at Bletchley Park to be able to basically cheat the system. And, that's what it was about. When you're dealing with, odds of breaking into an encryption device that, for the 3-rotor is 150 million to 1. That's like winning a national lottery every single day for 100 years. Good luck. You need a way of speeding that up. And the same thing later when they introduced the Four-Rotor in 1942. It now becomes 92 septillion to 1 shot. So, of course, they're building the bombs, what they call the bombs, BOMBE, that are going to tackle that problem. But to speed them up, it's kind of like Google. You don't just hit Google and say, hey, let me see what's out there. You add keywords, right? And so that's essentially what the captured material is doing. It's giving the ability for the cryptographers at Bletchley Park to insert keywords. And then by doing that, they can also see the intellectual approach that the Germans take to this. And that's key, because although the Germans suspected that on occasion the British would be able to penetrate their system, they never expected a sustained and continual penetration, which is exactly what the British were doing. And so there is a huge intellectual discrepancy in the approaches. So this is what Fleming finds himself involved with. And the other thing that I noticed, which was absolutely fascinating, was that Fleming, being the trust fund baby that he was, extremely wealthy young man, was also a technocrat. And this is something that we don't think about. We tend to think about him as being rather fluffy, and that his brother, Peter Fleming, was the brains in the family, and could very well be. But Ian was not fluffy. Ian was very much into science and technology and had amassed the largest library in existence at the time, which is now, I think, at the University of Wisconsin, if I'm not mistaken, of science and technology. And according to some of the people who worked in DNI with him, his most cherished possession out of that whole collection was a book written by Charles Babbage. And if that name escapes you, it probably shouldn't, because he's what we would now consider to be the father of the computer. So as a result, there's much more to Fleming than simply this kind of fluffy playboy image that we see. And, part of it, I think, is his own doing. I can imagine him at the post-war writing Bond and kind of chuckling. In other words, because he's pushing the envelope on a lot of things, because, he does deal in, I forget what it is, maybe Russia with Love with cryptography. He deals with, certain of the arts that he was playing with, or the craft of intelligence. But I think in some cases, historically, it's come around to boomerang on him and boomerang on his memory. So number one was getting down to the importance or trying to figure out and establish the proper role and position of Ian Fleming in all of this.
So to recap where we are now, we're talking about 1942, which is like half time in the football game, if you like. We didn't know how long the war was going to last, but we're kind of at the pivotal bit. It's taking a break. Where are we going to go from now? And you have all the events coming up in 42 that proved to be pivotal later on, and Stalingrad, and anyway, whatever. So, you let for those who aren't familiar with what your book is about, who haven't read the first version or haven't seen the documentary, the whole essence is all about altering. It's all about the code breaking, the understanding what the Germans are saying. So we're not giving anything away. The premise of your book is that Dieppe was a pinch raid to find a four-rotor Enigma machine to enable us to go to the next. I'm simplifying it a little bit, but to go to the next stage of understanding German communications. That's kind of in a nutshell. I'm not getting that wrong, am I? Really? I've simplified it a little bit.
Yeah, it's obviously a bit more nuanced, and because of the time we have to do this. But essentially, it's to capture anything and everything to do with the four-rotor, which is now being distributed to the entire Kriegsmarine, not just to the submarines.
Yeah,
and the submarines in the Atlantic have been using it since February. But they discover on March 13th that surface vessels in the Channel have already been outfitted with the four-rotor version, except they haven't gone over to it yet. So in other words, you can kind of like my son just bought a PS5, PlayStation 5, but it plays the PS4 games. So it was the same thing with the four-rotor. The four-rotor could be set for three-rotor settings if needed. And so the ships that were getting the four-rotor, which was being distributed in a very protracted way, could use the four-rotor in a three-rotor setting. And unless they screwed up and sent a message using the four-rotor, not the three-rotor, which is exactly what happened on March 13th, that's when Bletchley picked this up and sent it right to Naval Intelligence saying, the four-rotor, which is giving us fits in the Atlantic, is now up in Norway, and it's now coming in the Channel as well. So basically what you're looking at is a massive potential blackout, an intelligence blackout. And the reason why this is so important is a lot of people think that when the United States comes into the war on December 7th, that's it. In other words, the war is won. Well, that's not the case, because as Roosevelt said, it's a battle of distribution. It's one thing to have millions of men back in the United States, oil, raw materials, all the things you needed to harness to win a war. But if you cannot control the sea lanes to be able to get it from point A to point B, you're going to be choked off. It's like cash flow in a business. In other words, it doesn't matter how much profit you're going to make at the end of the year. You need that operational cash flow immediately. And that's the kind of situation that Great Britain finds itself in. That is actually the situation in 1942. They're still very much hanging on. The American lifeblood hasn't really come in and, has flowed into it. And the sinkings that are going on are essentially half American, half British. And we're talking about the massive sinkings at sea when it comes to merchant vessels, mostly off the East Coast of the United States at this time. But the British are calculating somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 tons of shipping that they can lose without seeing a drop in stocks. Well, starting in 1941 until they broke into the three-rotor, and then starting again in 1942, you see those sinkings go up to 600 and 700,000 tons. So we're talking about twice the level that was considered to be acceptable. And as a result, you're going to look at massive drops in everything from oil to foodstuffs to raw material, the lifeblood of a war effort in England, starting in 43 and moving into 44, which of course, not only puts Great Britain in a very precarious position, but it also prevents the Allies from going on the offensive or taking the counteroffensive that much quicker, simply because you do have the problems of navigating sea lanes at the peril of running into German submarines. So you need a kind of weapon system where it can be a force multiplier, because you don't have industry churning out destroyers, corvettes, merchant vessels at a rate that is going to outpace what the Germans are doing. You need something else. And the ability to tap into German communications, read their intentions, okay? And this is key. By cryptography, you can find out what they hope, what they dream, what they fear. You can do the counting. You know what new technologies are coming. You can what new frequencies, new styles of wireless transmissions they're going to use. That is gold, without a doubt. It's like insider trading in the stock market. If you know exactly where you're going to hedge, it doesn't mean you're going to win every battle, like a poker game. If you know what's in your opponent's hand, he may just have such a great hand that you better fold. but at least you know.
At least you know, yeah. So
Limited damage.
so unwrapping another level, and there's conversations going on. Alex Black is joining and stuff and what have you. But again, Ultra. That's my job, is to play the dumb host.
Yep.
Ultra, in recent years, imitation game, Bletchley Park, blah blah blah. Ultra, I think, comes under that banner of helping us achieve a more efficient invasion of Europe. In that it's us planning an offensive role through the use of Ultra. But prior to that, as you've been establishing, in 1942, we're kind of on our asses still in Britain. We're trying to not lose at this point. Supplies are absolutely critical. We had been gaining ahead of steam, getting a bit of a momentum behind us by breaking the 3-rotor Enigma stuff, and then with the forthcoming 4-rotor, it's like we can lose everything we've gained. Start back again, and this is exactly the point of the game where we don't want to have to start again. We've just kind of equalized in soccer terms. We don't want to go down 2 goals again and have to start again. So that is why in 42 there's a kind of a different era of Ultra than there is perhaps we think of more conventionally in the 44 kind of era, when we're using it as a tool for offense. Again, I'm being rather simplistic about it.
No, you're right. As a matter of fact, if you take the example of what's happening in the Battle of the Atlantic, or the battle of, on the ocean,
and it is all about the Battle of Atlantic. That is what
it is.
Dieppe, we're talking about Dieppe, but before we get to Dieppe, and I think people are wondering why we're talking about what we're talking about, and that's exactly the way the book goes. We kind of got to go through this meandering kind of bit to get to the point.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I think we always look at Dieppe and we look at it from a land perspective and an air perspective.
Yeah.
But what has completely slipped out of sight for so many years is the fact that there is an absolute naval imperative here. That is absolutely primordial. It goes straight to the center of gravity for the entire Allied war effort. And I mean the entire Allied war effort. One thing with doing this book and re-examining 1942, you realize that, the war will not be lost if the Soviets go down, because if you keep control of the sea lanes, nobody's reaching England, period. And you can continue to fight, and you, in theory, can then take the fight back to Europe if you build up enough strength. But if the sea lanes go down, Russia is on its own and it's already teetering. So I would argue that, this is where perhaps Hitler's greatest mistake was not putting more resources into the Battle of the Atlantic. But in this particular case, you're right. When they first get Ultra between 1941 and into 1942, it's all about evasive routing of convoys. In other words, the idea is the anti-submarine technology of the time is not sufficient enough to take on the U-boats and the wolf packs with any kind of degree of certainty and confidence that you're going to sink more than they're going to sink of you. So the idea is figure out where they're going. You don't want to figure out where they are after the fact. In other words, it's too late then if you bump into them. You want to be able to send, troop convoys in particular away from harm's way. So the idea is to use it that way. Things start to shift, and this is where a lot of people...
And Alex Black made that very point a few minutes ago. It's about rerouting our convoys around U-boats. We haven't got the... We can't win the game yet. We're trying to avoid the game starting. Avoid the confrontations at this point of the war. We haven't built up enough strength yet to engage in the North Atlantic. So we've got to dodge first until we build up the strength.
Yeah, you always want to call your own tune. Right? You want to dance to your own tune. You don't want to dance to the enemies. And that's the problem, because in 39 to 42, when it comes to the naval war, you're dancing to the U-boat tune. So the idea is to be able to sidestep them at first. Now, that all changes starting in 43, 44, and 45 when you develop anti-submarine technology, weapon systems, and processes. And the command between Great Britain, or the cooperation between Great Britain, Canada, and the U.S. comes together. And other signals intelligence weapons like direction finding, traffic analysis, and radio fingerprinting start to come into their own. We don't have that before 1943. Cryptography is everything. But once you get all of that together from 43, 44 onwards, the game changes.
We get our air power dealing with submarines gets better. Depth charges improve. Torpedo, everything gets better and better and better. And the Germans at the same time are getting weaker and weaker and weaker in terms of their U-boat fleet and what have you. So it swings very much in our favor by that point, to such an extent that we can control the Atlantic to some extent, and we can do Operation Overlord and so on and so forth. But we are talking about 2 years out. We're talking about that a stage we do not know yet we're going to get to. We're hoping to get that way, but it is all kind of hanging in the balance upon the discovery of this changeover from 3 rotors to 4 rotors. Because I'll forget it, because it'll go back in the messages. Martin Harley, who was on Twitter this morning talking about it, is saying, if we do want to get 4-rotor machines, what about the Channel Islands? Why Dieppe? I know perhaps we're bringing up something before we need to get to it, but I'm just throwing it out there now. There are other places, if we want to get 4-rotor technology, there are more than one option of where to do it, but we can come up with that later as why Dieppe was chosen. But
Yeah, well, I mean, very simply, there was no indication that there was anything in the Channel Islands at that particular point.
Right.
That's the whole point. We do know that the channel ports have it, and also you're looking for supply distribution, communication supply distribution. We know that Dieppe has one. So the other thing that you have to look at too is just the size and allocation of forces. In other words, we don't have at that time the kind of forces available to combined operations that are going to be able to pull off a raid at, Calais or Le Havre or Boulogne or Cherbourg. They're massive ports. You need something that you could tackle that was within the size of a division. So you have things like Dieppe and Tréport and Ouistreham, things like that. But Dieppe is the only one, as far as we can see, that actually has a communication supply depot. And not to mention the fact that it has, and we're not just looking for a machine. I mean, that's you can retrofit a machine. What you're looking for are any of the ancillary documents, the cipher tables, right? How you set up the machine is really the key to the machine itself. You can rebuild a machine, you can put a 4th rotor on a machine, but unless you know all the layers that it takes to set up a machine on a daily basis, you're going to be in trouble. So as a result, you need to be able to capture the cryptographic aids, or I should say the signals aids that allow the operator to set up the machine on a daily basis. So these are done either monthly and sometimes they're stockpiled and distributed, particularly for ships, 3 months in advance. But what that does is it doesn't just give the code breakers the ability to tap in immediately. It gives them the material to develop the intellectual framework and systems to systematically and consistently break this information. And I think that's what's lost. We tend to see in the, things like the imitation game, that it's, the magic elixir. Oh boy, woof, here we go. And, we don't have to feed the beast every month. We don't have to keep, checking on it. And we do. Also, too, remember that the 4-rotor crisis did not spring upon the British on February 1st. As a matter of fact, and this is something that still needs a lot of questioning, something that is now starting to come to the forefront. They knew about its existence in 1941, in January of 1941. And so it appears that the raids that they were putting on in the summer of 1941 were actually done to try to get a 4-rotor that early. Which means that they were attempting to tackle the problem, but at the back end, they were sluggish in building the 4-rotor bombs. And that became a real bone of contention when they were writing the Bletchley histories at the end of the war. And there's a lot of unanswered questions about, hey, you knew the 4-rotor was coming in January of 41. Why don't we have 4-rotor bombs until the summer of 1943?
Yeah.
Well, the prima facie that I can see right now is that we just, the Brits stuck their head in the sand. In other words, it took so much out of us to break into the 3-rotor. Holy God, let's hope the 4-rotor doesn't come in. In other words,
exactly. It's like we don't even want to think about this eventuality, so let's kind of just ignore it for a while. So as I suspect it was going to happen with this show, I'm not sure which bit to do next, because the conversations are already starting. The cynicism, which is healthy and good, and we welcome it, and I'm glad there is a cynicism there. But for example, Scott Grimwood said to me, raiding Dieppe with troops and tanks to grab an Enigma is like breaking into a bank vault using a fully loaded B-52.
That's exactly what it was. Exactly. Well, thank you, Scott, for bringing that up.
Then David Zeldin said, kind of read the book. So at this point, I'm now wondering whether we go down what your theory about
tackle
Dieppe is,
let's tackle
or do
that.
we dismiss the other ones? Which way do we go now? Do we go?
Okay, let's tackle that, because you brought it up, and I think Scott is dead on, and I think that's the impression. But that's what comes out in the documents, in the files. The fact that, as Godfrey says, it was all about using a steam hammer to crack a nut.
Yeah.
Because the idea was to use disproportional force to confuse the enemy for what you were actually after. This is not something I'm pulling out of, parts of my body. This is something that was part of a playbook and a pinch doctrine and policy. And so one of the reasons, and you and I talked about this, one of the reasons why I felt confident enough, almost 10 years ago now, to shoot off my mouth and say this is what Dieppe was all about, was because I saw the documents that lay out the fact that there was a policy. I had assumed all of this was kind of ad hoc in nature. In other words, the intelligence assault unit was the caboose, not a locomotive. And, so for many years, that's the way I was envisioning it, but that's not the case. Not the case at all. There is a doctrine that was developing where you have a pinch by opportunity, a pinch by chance, and a pinch by design. So in other words, opportunity or chance is very simple. Come across something in the middle of a battle, kind of like with U-110, or, at the end, later on with various U-boats, like, you weren't targeting them, but now there's an opportunity, there's a chance that you're going to grab it. Opportunity, meaning you have a raid laid on, or some sort of operation laid on, which is likely going to bring into your hands the kind of material you're looking for. So be prepared for it. And then pinch by design. We have a problem. We need to solve it, build up an operation, and go get what we're looking for. So basically, Dieppe comes down to the argument between pinch by opportunity, pinch by design. But the way that they were covering these was that disproportionate force allocation. And this is something that they did in Norway. This is something that they did out in the North Atlantic, where to go after a tiny trawler, okay, just a tiny weather trawler that has the material, they laid on a force of 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers to go after that. Because in their mind, they were wanting to give the impression to the German that this was simply incidental contact.
Yeah.
That no way in your right mind would you ever allocate those kind of forces. And that is not something that, like I said, I'm pulling out. That's something that's in the document, and it's called the steam hammer to crack a nut. And that comes right from John Godfrey.
I mean, this is the point, isn't it? I've read books with theories where there's lots of conjecture, there's lots of, and if we extrapolate this, there's reason to believe possibly we can look at this and maybe this was everything you say, every claim you make, every suggestion is backed up by here's the document that it's enclosed in. Here's what this person said, this person. Here's the archive that says this. It's not like you're not, as you said, you're not pulling this out of your ass. This is based on documentary evidence. So, it is fascinating. And so shall we just briefly, although we may have to come back on it, let's briefly look at prior to what this being a pinch raid, shall we just run through what the previous suggestions as the purpose of the Dieppe raid were first, and kind of briefly explain why you don't believe them to be correct? So let's start with preparation for Normandy. Let's start with practice. Let's look at that one first.
First of all, what everybody has to get their head around, and a lot of historians have already, so certainly give credit where credit's due, is the fact that the nature of the Dieppe operation is nowhere near like an invasion. Just because you're coming across the channel in ships does not mean that you're coming across to establish a bridgehead, build up a bridgehead with the kind of logistical tail. That doesn't make any sense. You're not doing that. This is indeed, as Churchill said, a one-day butcher and bolt or reconnaissance in force. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. You don't have that. It's completely different nature. Also, Dieppe is not a port of sufficient capacity. So in other words, if you're trying to go to, quote, capture a port, it's the wrong size of port. In other words, you're not going to bring a Lada to a Formula One event. You have to show up for what you need. And if this is the case, you need Calais, Le Havre, Boulogne, Antwerp, and all of them if possible. In other words, Dieppe may be a deep water port, but its capacity is so small. You're not going to build a bridgehead around that. So with the exception, perhaps, of learning some unconventional lessons, and there's no evidence anywhere in the documents that show that this is the driving force Okay. All the lessons learned come after the fact. And there is no reason, if you're going out to, to learn lessons, that you don't write about it in advance. There's no reason. There's no reason you can do it. But as Alex Black and Mike Bechtold, who are watching, have argued, you're looking at North Africa, you're looking at Sicily, you're looking at Anzio for the lessons, the genuine lessons that you're going to learn for something like Normandy. And there's another thing that's escaped the historiography, is the fact that just a few months before Dieppe, the British pull off the invasion, the amphibious invasion of Madagascar. In other words, if you want to, learn genuine lessons, and yes, you're not going up against Hitler's Atlantic Wall, but the point is that's not necessarily what you need to test. What you need to do is be able to test all of your capabilities for getting ashore, staying ashore, and exploiting and moving on. And this is not something that the British have forgotten. The British have a pretty good tradition of amphibious operations.
Yeah, we're both well and badly.
Better for worse.
We've had it across the board. So and again, that idea of it being a practice raid, it's I'm going to bring football into it again. It's that idea when a team plays the kids in a cup game, and they get humped 6-0, and the coach says, it was just a run out for the kids. You're thinking it wasn't. You were trying to win that, but because you lost, you're now just saying it was a run out for the kids. You really thought those kids would beat that other team, but they didn't. So you kind of now, it's the post-event rationalizing of a kind, not an error, but something that appeared to be something. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There are proper, actual, sustained landings that are teaching us way more. And there's the Pacific as well, for Christ's sake. I mean, how many landings are we doing month by month in the Pacific that are teaching us way more about mounting large-scale amphibious invasions than things like Bruneval, Aquatint, Sark, Frankton, Sand. They're not teaching anything about invasions. They are completely separate to that. And Dieppe, you're saying, is in that category.
Well, exactly. One of the reasons why we always hear that this is a large-scale invasion or large-scale raid, it's not. That's a misnomer. And that comes out in the files, that nowhere do they consider this a large-scale raid. As a matter of fact, medium to small were 5,000 men under. When you're talking about large-scale raids, you're talking about something like Operation Sledgehammer, which was designed to create a bridgehead on the Cherbourg Peninsula to draw the Germans into attrition. Or Operation Imperator, Wet Bob, etc. These were the ones that were designed to get on shore, stay on shore, albeit temporarily, to draw off German air power and land forces from the east. Dieppe is not going to do that. Not one day. Not at all. This is nothing more than a pinprick. And, it's water off a duck's back to the Germans. They're not going to be alerted because Mountbatten is running up and down the coast, popping in, popping out. That's not going to change their strategic thinking. And that is not, rationalization after the fact. This is what's in the files, the chiefs of staff files, Churchill himself. Basically, and the Navy and the Air Force saying, look, we don't need to do anything like this, or what you want to do with Dieppe is not going to do it. So you see, right from the start, you have to get your head around the nature of what the Dieppe operation actually is.
Yeah. So in terms of the fact that, I can't just look at my watch. We've been out 50 minutes. So it's amazing how time is flying. So, I'm having fun. So let's dismiss the practice in terms of an amphibious invasion. The next one on the list is a PR stunt, purely about, kind of a, so I'm going to use the word briefly, let's kind of throw that one out.
Okay. Very simply, there's no weight in that at all. Simply because political warfare executive responsible for this is not even part of the planning. As a matter of fact, they find out about it near the end, just before it goes in. And they're thoroughly pissed off because they now realize that what is about to happen is not going to go with their narrative that they have created over the summer. And so as a result, they're worried about it. They're worried about the rebound effect. And you can see it. Peter Murphy is one of the high execs in political warfare executive who writes a series of scathing reports, and particularly one after the fact when Mountbatten approaches him to start carving the PR idea. In other words, we were doing this for PR purposes. So there is nothing there about it beyond the typical, creation of a cover story to be able to, that fits in all. But we don't have that. PWE is not an integral part of the planning at any step of the way. They're caught off guard. They're pissed off because it doesn't fit with the narrative. So you're not going to put on an operation like this that doesn't fit with the narrative of what you're trying to do for PR if it's for PR. And there are other ways of achieving that. You can go on, bomber raids. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why they were rushing to get the first 1,000 plane raid up and over was for propaganda purposes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? It's for propaganda purposes. And of course, Churchill himself said, look, it's not going to help PR. It's not going to help the Russians if we have a cropper of our own. So he's, there's also this hesitancy on the part of Churchill and the chiefs of staff to actually take on anything that potentially will have a rebound effect on them, unless it is absolutely central for the war effort.
So the next one is the whole Stalin second front kind of thing. And interestingly, no one's mentioned that in the comments. So I don't really want to go down that part. I mean, a little bit, sure, but
probably requires a show in itself. But
yeah, exactly. I fear that's another thing. But yeah, just kind of build a small case for why you do not believe that to be the case.
That's partially true, and it partially isn't, but probably not for the reasons we thought. In other words, the concept of the second front, although Stalin has thrown it out there as kind of a blanket, is really not something he's genuinely pushing for in 1942. That sounds funny because he does mention it, but he is quite happy when Churchill goes to Moscow to hear of Operation Torch. He is sober enough to realize, despite, how bad things are on the Eastern Front, that, the Allies don't have that capability of getting across the channel and setting up shop in Western Europe. They just don't have it at this time. And he's sober to that. But where the aid to the Soviets still remains is the convoys. And that is one thing that has kind of been overlooked. And when you take a look at the chiefs of staff communications and the communications between Churchill and Stalin, the reason Churchill ends up in Moscow for a meeting is not because of the second front. It's because he suspended the convoys after the PQ-17 disaster. And why has he suspended the PQ-17 disaster? Because the Tirpitz is using the four-rotor machine and they don't have any way of getting into finding out the intentions of the Tirpitz the way they did with the Bismarck the year before. So this freaks out Dudley Pound. Anyway, so as a result, they suspend the convoys. Now, when I was researching this, I realized that there's much more to unpack about the convoys. No pun intended. They were much more important than we ever imagined. Not because they were bringing Valentine tanks and aircraft and trucks and whatever else, and they were thrown into battle. That's fine. But remember that in 1941, the Russians are on the retreat. The policy of scorched earth is in effect. They are moving their industries that have survived to Siberia. The entire Soviet industrial base needs to be revamped and retooled. They do no longer have access to the kind of machinery and resources that they need. Bauxite, aluminum, diamonds for cutting. All these things that are choke points in industry, they desperately need to get their hands on. And so those convoys are bringing those absolutely vital materials to the Soviets. So every time a convoy is delayed or sunk or whatever else, you end up losing the ability to retool your industry as quick as you want to if you're the Soviets. Also, too, Stalin tends to look at this as the gesture. The second front is not the gesture to keep the Soviets in the war. It is really the supply convoys. And even then, there's reports coming back to the British that at no time has Stalin ever said or even hinted at they are going to pull out of the war. Where that came from in the historiography, I'm still not sure. But that is one of the, I would argue the urban legends of this time, is that if we don't do something in 1942 in the summer, oh my God, the Soviets are going to pull out. No, they're going to be pissed off, and it's going to impact post-war relations without a doubt. But it's not going to impact, their ability.
The immediate situation, yeah.
The immediate situation. So there you go. There's a very short way of dealing with what easily could have been an episode in itself.
Well, that is exactly what we discussed in advance, is that, you know, how long we spend at this, and I'm reading the comments, and Ben Main, of course, has done lots of shows with me, a British historian. He's kind of at the stage I was maybe 6 months ago. You know, he's still a little bit arms folded. You know, I can't believe this, and that's fine. And you've accepted that, and you're prepared to, you know, kind of argue your case. And you know, so I was at the point when we talked about this however many months ago that I could see that the seizing of an Enigma machine and associated paperwork and code books and things was a potential bonus for the raid, but I hadn't kind of accepted that it was the actual main purpose. I think that's where Ben is at. Ben is saying, you know, one of many purposes, some needless, using Royal Marine commandos to steal vessels from the harbour, for example. And he then goes on to say, fortunately, they did not land and suffer the same fate as the Canadians had. But so,
well, actually,
it's kind of where I was a little.
Okay,
again,
now
we're kind of nearly an hour in now. And I'm enjoying, and our people are enjoying it. So I think it's time now, accepting the fact we're not going to, folks, we're not going to get to the complete bottom of this in one show. We're going to come back and look at the actual specifics of how the raid unfolded in a future show. We're still talking very much about the conception of it and why it was set up, and of course, don't forget, there's another big thing is we refer to Dieppe as Operation Jubilee, but it is a new version of Rudder, which was around earlier. So
yeah, there's actually 3 versions of the plan. That's one thing that people don't realize. There's Rudder, and then they pare it down into what is called Rudder 2. And Rudder 2 is essentially Jubilee. Yeah. And that's it. You know, there really isn't anything that's changed for that. And Rudder 2 is the one that's supposed to go in on July 7th when they postpone the operation. And it's not shut down and it's not remounted. And that's, again, one of the fallacies in our understanding. There's a continuum. In other words, the commanders are all kept and retained. It's just the men are disembarked from the ship and told to go back. But the infrastructure for launching this operation is there. It's part of Mountbatten's concept of the double bluff, which he suggested doing before St. Nazaire. So this is not, you know, this is basically why we see the, you know, Dieppe turn out to be the way it is between Rudder and Jubilee, because there's actually an intermediary point called Rudder 2. And so that is always lost. We always jump from Rudder to Jubilee, and we're wondering why everything changed. But maybe to get back to the question that came up about the Royal Marines. The Royal Marines were there right from the inception. As part of my research, I discovered their operational orders, which have never been seen before. And in there, it lays out specifically what they were going to do and how they were going to do it. In other words, there were 4 contingencies to get into the port, and we'll go into this in detail. But the key here is that the Royal Marines were in on the Dieppe raid before anybody else. They were there in the outline planning phase before any other forces were allocated to this. And basically, the chiefs of staff sign off on the outline plan, which means the pinch is in right from the beginning with the Royal Marines, and then it's handed off to the commanders to do the detailed planning. So to use, you know, sports analogy, and I'm going to switch, I'm going to use North American football here.
Which is absolutely fine, yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, you know. There's a few of us on this side of the pond. The idea is you've got a running back, a really good running back who can't go side to side. He just goes down the middle. So basically, that's what they're looking at. Go down the middle, get what you need, and get out. And so you're going to build up your team around your running back and give him a great offensive line to create the holes for him. So basically, what we see in the transition from outline plan to detailed plan is the filling in of the rest of the team around what the Royal Marines are up to and their imperative. And of course, because of the ultra security, with the exception, you know, they have to speak in some cases veiled terms, but you understand later on what they're after, where they're after. You can connect the dots very easily. And no assumptions, no leaps of faith or anything like that. So you can see it. But of course, as you mentioned, it's laid out in the book.
Yeah, I mean, and that's you know, I'm conscious of the fact, you know, we're of time and what have you, and constraints and whatever, which is I think that my aim now ought to be to leave the people we've got kind of anticipating the next time we talk about this. But essentially, where we are now at this point is that this idea when I very much liked the bit early when, you know, people were saying it's like attacking a bank vault with a B-52, and you're going, exactly, that is the point. And I've come into this as a British historian living in France, that it's all about landing several thousand Canadian troops, blah blah blah, on beaches, and then everything else, Royal Marines, Rangers, side things, is added, apart from the actual operation to silence guns, which is slightly separate, is all added on as part of the infantry assault. But the point, the case you make and build and do very, very well is no, that the Royal Marines bit comes first, and everything else piles on around that. And your book absolutely lays that out, chapter by chapter, point by point, archival approach. And that's why, you know, I said to you, because I was giving David progress reports of how far I was getting through the book. Because I had various shows coming up, I had to leave it for a couple of days and go back to it. And I said, I'm up to whatever it was, page 200 or something on the year. And I was kind of half converted halfway through, 3/4 converted 3/4 way through. And by the time I got and finished the epilogue, which I actually read twice because I really enjoyed the epilogue, that was it. You'd hit a home run, you'd sold it to me. And I was like, yeah, well, no, I concede. Okay, white flag, yeah, you got me. And again, I'm going to emphasize what you said to the people who are perhaps at this stage still understandably cynical and skeptical, is like, read the book. You know, read the book. This is it. You know, you can't, in a 1 hour show, even if we do 3 of these shows, we still can't cover what you've done in the whole book. And in the book, there's old tangents, because you have the footnotes that lead to, you should read this archive here. You could go off and do a supporting book about
various aspects that come up. Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, you know, talking about 1942 and Anglo-Soviet relations. I mean, my God, that complete rethink. There's no doubt about that. I mean, that was one of the problems, or one of the good things, I suppose, as a historian, as I'm going through the contextual evidence that's been presented, that backs up the traditional Dieppe narrative. And you realize how many holes there are in our understanding, how much, and a lot of it had to do with just lack of available documents and sources. You know, a lot of great historians in the past have come through and done the best that they can, without a doubt. And it's not necessarily that I've done anything special. It's just that I have taken advantage of the fact that we live in a digitized world where I can go through 150,000 pages. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you know,
sorry, I interrupt you there. So let's, we originally talked about this, folks, is whether David was going to do his PowerPoint presentation. There's an entire PowerPoint presentation of 140 odd pages. There's animations of the sequence events in the harbor. There's all this stuff there, and we probably will come and do that in further shows. It's just that we're not going to now. But what I like about the format that we've developed here is it is kind of like a pub chat between people who know what they're talking about. And I'm very grateful that the people who are watching these shows also know what they're talking about. These aren't just people who've read a comic, you know, looked on Wikipedia. These are people who have, you know, Martin and Alexander and Ben Main. These are people who've read extensively. That Martin has been to Dieppe many times, been there on the anniversary, walked up the beaches, walked the harbor, do that. These aren't people, this is not their first rodeo, you know. So we're at a level where we want to. So we're in a pub. Imagine that all these guys are at the same table as you. I've just bought a round of drinks on the table, kind of lay out in kind of summary version to unwrap them later, your main points why of your evidence for this being a pinch raid.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Should we do that now?
Yeah. I mean, number one,
run through the epilogue in a sense, you know?
Yeah. Well, number one, you can see the continuum. I mean, they have a desperate need to do this because of the weapon system and its impact on the center of gravity of the Allied operations, the war at sea. The fact that they've developed a pinch doctrine that actually shows how they're doing these operations. The fact that there's historical precedent for them doing it twice in Norway, on the western coast of France at Saint-Nazaire, and also in Bayonne. Plus, of course, a whole slew of operations out at sea in the summer of 1941. You can see the development of this pinch doctrine, and it just then ends up, you know, arriving at Dieppe. But one thing I need to say is all these comments that are coming in are fantastic because they challenge the historian to either think or to go down that rabbit hole, as we say,
Yeah.
to be able to test these micro hypotheses that are coming out. And that has always fueled me. And I'll give you an example. Somebody had asked, and it wasn't in the first edition, why Dieppe and why at this point? Why at the end of March? Well, I ended up going down and researching it and discovering that on March 13th, that's when they had the discovery. They made the discovery that the Four-Rotor has been distributed to the 2nd Defense Division, which is operating between Boulogne and Cherbourg and using all the ports in between. So just to give you an example, you know, it was one little bit of criticism like that that spurred me to go on and do further research in something. And it's I guess, you know, when you open up something like this, it becomes intoxicating. In other words, it's very difficult. And, you know, if anybody knows me, you know how much I love to be in the archives and everything else. So but it's fascinating. And it's so bloody important. Because at the end of the day, for historians, it's about trying to establish the truth. And, you know, it requires, in this case, a hell of a lot of research, without a doubt. And that's what's gone into the book. And so I certainly invite criticism, but I would, like I said, please read the book, because I think what we're doing, or what the book does, is it closes the old chapter on Dieppe. It answers a whole bunch of the old questions, but then it opens up a whole new set of questions moving forward. And so that's really what I'd like to see. Like 39 to 42 is over. It's time for us to counterattack. And, you know, that's kind of what I want to see on this from a historiographical perspective. I want to see people asking about the Tirpitz, or people asking about the Second Front, or, you know, Soviet relations, or relations between the Americans and the Brits and naval intelligence and whatever else. That's what I want to see out of this. I don't want to go back and rehash what has, you know, easily been, you know, refuted, you know, not only by my research, by some of the earlier research as well. You know, a lot of the things that come up in my book have been tackled and, you know, have been, you know, put to rest, or should have been put to rest, by either Hugh Henry, who's done some great work, Peter Henshaw, Brian Villa, or John Campbell back in the day. Even Robin Nealons. Robin Nealons, I think, was so close to cracking this. He was, as I mentioned to you, he was like a blind dog at a meat house. He could smell it, couldn't find it. And he was questioning the centrality of the Royal Marines. In other words, why were the Royal Marines there? And then they become the key to it all. So as a result, you certainly see the need, the developing doctrine, etc. And more importantly, when you go back and take a look at all the planning documents and the chiefs of staff and the context of 42, you realize that Dieppe is never mentioned in any of the other contexts that have been laid out for its narrative. In other words, it's never mentioned in the breadth of supporting the Soviets. There are other operations out there that will do that, the Cri de Coeur and everything else. They're going to be handled by something else. It travels on its own plane, in its own lane, and it is it's kind of mysterious in the sense that it passes through all the channels very quickly, like a hot knife through butter. In other words, there's an imperative to this. And quite obviously, I've been able to make the case for what the imperative was, which was the war.
And when we come to do the show, when we are either boots on the ground in Dieppe, or we're using Google Earth, or whatever it will be, and we can go for it. I mean, I again, I don't want to kind of steal what we're going to do in a future show. The kind of the thing that convinced me that I was already convinced, but the kind of the icing on the cake was during the operation itself, when there's a whole lot of conflicting information going back there, and Ian Fleming is there, and other people are there, is that they do pour people into the shittiest part of the town, when actually at that point if it is to be the conventional version of a butcher and bolt, there's other places you could put them to do something. But the fact that they seem intent on getting for this bit 4 times it's kind of was the bit that said, yeah, okay, you've absolutely got me now. Why would you pour in more people into that part if it wasn't to get to Hotel Modern, naval headquarters, all that kind of stuff?
Maintenance of the objective, exactly.
So you know, it's always just fascinating to talk to you, and I think your point you made there about it being the end of one chapter and the beginning of another is very pertinent there, because we talked about in our pre-show, we've had that a lot in the last few years with understanding things like the Dam Busters raid, the escape from Stalag Luft 3, the Battle of Britain. There's been kind of an old way of looking at things, and then it turns 180 and goes back, and then sometime after that the needle kind of makes its balance back in the middle, and we began to understand things, kind of seeing that kind of balanced in the gray area place rather than swinging it one. So I think this is, I like you said in the before we went on, live about the fact that young historians coming on and say, okay, now we've got this, we've ruled out some of the previous ways of looking at it, and we've got this maybe new way we can re-examine the evidence, look for more evidence, look for more archives, look again with a slightly more open-minded attitude, and I think we'll find even more things that back up what you're saying. So
yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I think it's key to understand here that again, like we've said a few times here, this is not just some theory that's, being pulled out of the air here. 150,000 pages, 25 years of research, 300 gigs of material. You're getting the cutting edge of what is out there. And if you are going to challenge something that has been ingrained, and you're going to do it in a proper revisionist sense, and I say proper, revisionist, because history by nature is revisionist. I mean,
yeah.
We don't know everything about anything or everything about everything, so we try to do it. You got to lay it out this way. You've got to be able to do it, and that's why, for instance, I think some people may have seen the documentary, and the documentary is 66 minutes only, and it's very difficult in 66 minutes to lay out how over 25 years and 150,000 pages, this all went into it. It's kind of like walking into math class, screaming the right answer and never showing your work. People, of course, are going to say, wait a second. And that's fully understandable, without a doubt. But that's that's the big reason why I had to write the book. And so as a result, without a doubt, be skeptical, be questioning, but please read the damn book and see the evidence.
Yeah, and it's and maybe in an odd way, the documentary kind of slightly did more harm because you hadn't got the next phase of archives and documents and resources, and so maybe you played your hand a bit too early, and maybe a little bit more patience. But then that was the revelation of what you'd found, and people, filmmakers, they want to bring out the new secret version of this. So. I hadn't actually read the first book. I had seen the documentary, but it was this new book, as I said, I repeat myself, that kind of tipped me over the edge. And edge. So I think we'll kind of bring things to an end fairly shortly. But I think what has been most fascinating is watching the development of conversations. And when we're finished, Dave, go back and watch the comments, because there's, as often is the case, the sidebar conversations are as interesting as what's going on between the two of us on screen. Put it all together.
Well, and like I said, I'm happy to deal with them. I mean, my God, please, get in touch with me either through social media or email or whatever else. And if there's a question that you have and I can shed more light on it, by all means, please do. At the end of the day, it's about enlightenment. It's about learning more, and so, yeah, please, by all means.
But to kind of bring things to an end, tell me about, because I found it really interesting, about how you laid out the documents to the veteran, whose name I've forgotten now, because I think that will just, we've been talking a lot about operating. We said at the beginning, we're going to give respect to the men who fell there, and let's kind of finish with, for this show, how you sat with this. Well, frame the story for us and explain how that went, because I think that's a really interesting way to end this.
It is. It turned out to be, and what you're mentioning is, you can see it in the documentary, and it's when we sat down with Ron Beale. Now, quickly, Ron Beale, I think he was 19 at the time. He ends up going ashore at Blue Beach. He's in the third wave, and so by the time he gets off the landing craft, the beach is red with blood, and he ends up miraculously making it across under German fire and hunkering down under the cliff. Well, he just basically sits there and watches for the next couple of hours as all his friends are mowed down. Then he's taken prisoner, spends 2.5 years in a prisoner of war camp, does the forced march, and then comes back. And at the end of the day, the guys at Dieppe were kind of treated like pariahs by their unit, because their units had all rebuilt in the 2nd Division, went off and fought in Normandy, and they had the Band of Brothers stories about liberating Western Europe. And now these guys come back from Dieppe, and they sort of are the square pegs that don't fit in the round holes. Well, they ended up creating their own Dieppe Association, Dieppe Veterans Association, largely because they felt like outsiders. And Ron was their president at one particular time, but he had spent his entire life curious about, to say the least, about the intent behind the raid. So we went to interview him for Dieppe Uncovered. And I just kind of figured it would be your simple interview. Let's get your reaction. What do you think? And whatever else about, give me your experiences. And it wasn't something that a historian generally does. Usually when we do interviews, we don't really lay out our story. And it was actually my filmmaking partner, Wayne Abbott, give credit to him. He said, look, the man's 92. You got to tell him. In other words, you can't just leave him thinking, because a year from now when the documentary comes out, he may not be around. And I said, okay, well, it's not traditional, but what the hell? So we did. And we sat down with him for 3.5 hours. And we took him through, not all 150,000, that was impossible, but we took him through what we call the Gretzky files. So in other words, the Gretzky files were the best of the best that we had out of the 150,000, most of the ones that either made the TV or the book, subsequent books. And for 3.5 hours, we took him through this. And it was incredible. It was something that I was hesitant about doing at first, and now profoundly grateful that I did, because I could see sort of the watershed moment in his life right there. And he understood, he grasped the documents, he grasped the significance, he understood, he'd been studying Dieppe all his life. So it wasn't hard for him to sort of put everything together. And so as a result, we put him back on film. And we asked him, would you be interested now? We asked you for the standard before, you've now seen the documents. And he just said, look, I'm shocked. And you can certainly see this at the end of the documentary. He said, it doesn't matter whether, we reached our target or not. There was a purpose for this raid. And he said, now I know why my friends died, and I can die in peace. And so when he said that, you can imagine, as a historian, I thought, oh, Jesus, I better go back and I better, cross my T's and dot my I's on this research, because probably for the first time in my life, I certainly understood that history was important. I just didn't realize it was going to be that powerful. And that was the key with Beale. And so, what possibly could have boomeranged turned out to be one of the most instructive and fundamentally appreciative moments of my life.
Yeah, and Martin is saying now how he's visiting the graves of an Essex Scottish guy, and that I think that's a fitting way to end it, is as we started it, really, which is that those who have been to Dieppe, those who have studied the battle, whatever the reason for it is one way of looking at the operation. But of course, men died. It was tragic. It led to lots of men in captivity the next 2-3 years, and nothing changes that. Nothing changes the fact that men died. Nope. For a noble reason, whatever the reason was, and the old version of the history, the new version, nothing changed and takes anything away from that. So, I never knew quite how we were going to work this show. We went online before, still discussing how we're going to do. We had some bits of video and stuff ready to show, and we will do that in a second. I think what this has done is it's got us off and running. It's established the fact that what what you've been doing, your methodology, your understanding of the archives, your approach, and the fact you frankly didn't even really want to tackle this subject. You didn't have the end in sight. You just got intrigued by it all, and one thing led to something else, and it was, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting, and that's it. And then suddenly it became a kind of as you said, 25-year obsession. This isn't something you pulled out in your ass in a weekend. This has been a long time coming, and I figure it'll continue. It's just one of those things. I can't get away from it now. Yeah, not that I would want to, but it's just one of those things that you put your mark into something like this, and then you're going to be dealing it forever, without a doubt. So I think we'll bring it to end there. So we've done 1 hour and 20 minutes. So for those who haven't watched it, I'm going to feel like teacher now, saying before we come back for next week's class, make sure, children, you have all read the book. I mean, I'm not on commission there, but if you've all read the book for next time, children, you'll find out what we're talking about will make a lot more sense. Yeah. And as Ben Main, who'd read the 2013 edition, there's a whole lot more in the new edition compared to that. So we've kind of just begun this subject. We've kind of unwrapped it a bit. There's quite a few more layers of wrapping to go before we get to the bottom of it. And we will definitely do a show where we either on site or using your PowerPoint, we'll break through the actual how the attack went in, and the phase by phase, inner harbor, outer harbor, beach by beach. We'll do that. This has just been an introduction, so I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I think people watching it have enjoyed it. You've already converted a couple of people just by our chat today. Others are quite rightly, understandably, still a little bit.
Either way,
fine.
read the book.
You have dealt with this before. It's not like this is the first time someone stood opposite you with arms folded, going, "Yeah, well, sell it to me, David."
That's the entire journey.
Yeah, it's been about that all the way. So you are supremely confident of your findings. You have got the evidence to back up everything you say, and you're now waiting to be disproven. That's it. Here's your assertion. And now it's the historians there. And there are some incredible historians watching this to kind of read it and go, okay, but. And when we come back for a second show, third show, if they've got some valid buts, we can unwrap them as well, can't we? That's the whole point.
Without a doubt. I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's search for the truth. And, it was one of those things, if I'm testing this hypothesis and I go to the trouble of going through all the stuff that I've gone through and all the time, if it was something else, we'd be talking about something else right now. That's the key.
That is it, isn't it? You do. We said that earlier. You've examined everything you've suggested all the way through. You've been self-critical. You've tried to disprove your own workings, and that's what's fascinating about it. That's the whole art of science and theories, and putting a new suggestion out there and allowing your peers to examine it, throw it back at you, and go, "I'm not sure about that." And you've done all that work. You've done all that work, and you've given us a very, 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 very readable book. I mean, that's the thing. In addition to the being profoundly enlightening in terms of what I thought I knew about the operation being perhaps not correct, it also was just an easy read as well. I mean, that makes a difference.
I think that's part of the challenge, right?
A page turning element to it as well, which is always good. So brilliant. We will. I don't know when we'll bring David back, but we will bring David back for part 2 and possibly a part 3.
Part 3 would have to be the on-site.
Mike Bechtold just said, really enjoyed this today. Thanks. Always something new to learn, which I think is any of us who think we know everything are wrong. I will keep learning until the day they nail me in my box.
Yeah,
I'll still be going, but I want to read one more book. Let me have one more. So there we are. Deep conversation. In terms of those watching, this is our, as I say, double header day. We're back at 7:00 UK time with Eric Ratcliffe to talk about a slightly easier to understand story, that of the US Army Air Force raid on Kassel in September 1944, although Eric has also done some pretty intensive research into that, but I don't think it's anything quite as groundbreaking as what we've uncovered today, but that'll be very interesting to combat that. And then after that, it's nothing at least yet till next Friday, which is part 1 of my World War II comics show with Garth Ennis and the various other incredible guests coming up. I may try and squeeze something in on Tuesday or Wednesday because I get bored and I go and bother Mag if I'm not something to work on. I go and hassle her, so she'll get another show in. But anyway, for those watching, don't forget to click subscribe. Don't forget to click the button to the bell to get the notifications. Do consider joining our Patreon setup. And thanks to all the new patrons who joined me in the last couple of weeks. It's very, very appreciated. It makes me want to carry on doing all this hard work and the prep and the reading and the questions. Thank you to David. It's been incredible to talk to you. I enjoy it. We did a quick chat yesterday that lasted an hour. That was an audio check that lasted an hour. We just seemed to kind of unravel. We went into Den Brotheridge and we talked about Operations Frankton and San Nazaire. Anyway, we'll do that in the future. So David, enjoy your day. For those watching, I'll see you again at 7:00 UK tonight for the Kassel raid. Brilliant. Have a nice afternoon. I'm going to end the stream now. So thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. Well, yeah, we didn't even get anywhere near the videos.
That's okay.